Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this training session on some of the iGen products and their integration with the inverters. I think we are going to start. So thank you to all those attending, and we look forward to working with you in the future. Just one or two house rules from our side. We ask that you please mute yourself and that you can then unmute yourself when we get to the Q&A sessions and you do have a question. We also ask that you please do not turn on your video, just to limit the bandwidth usage. There will be a Q&A session between the sessions, so please raise your hand if you do have a question, or you can type your question in the chat and it will then be answered. So this session aims to introduce some of our products and give an introduction to integrating to most of the common inverter subsets. A recording of the session will be distributed afterwards. So with no further ado, I will hand over to Job Base, CTO of iGen.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Skulk. Welcome to this training session. We are a little bit of a small group this morning, so let's keep it informal. If there's any other questions, you're welcome to type it also in the chat group, and we'll get to that. As we mentioned, everyone will get that recording, as well as any of the presentations that we have. And if you have any questions, we have that email available at the end also for you to have any questions. So without further ado, let me just start the presentation. All right, so just a quick overview of iGen and what we basically do. We basically manufacture lithium iron phosphate storage solutions, and we do always have a methodology to keep it stackable or modular in a way. So we also wanted to just cover how do you connect those things. We'll take the E-stack as an example. And then also, how do you do a specific installation with Victron, with SunSynk, and then obviously have any questions that you might have. So let's just have a quick overview of what we have and what we have as an offering on our side. First of all is the E-stack. The E-stack is one of our flagship products. We essentially have a block methodology. I affectionately call it a Lego. Where each block is 5.4 kilowatt hours per block, and then you can stack those on top of each other up to 27 kilowatt hours. Each block is a 1C output unit, basically 100 amp hour sustained charge and discharge, and we also have them interlocking on each other, so you don't need an extra rack system or anything like that is needed. They're freestanding on the floor and they interlock with each other. What's also quite nice with them, they have a front cover, which will allow you to cover all of the DC interconnects on the front as well as your communication. And it gives it basically a nice appearance as well as a COC prerequisite essentially for that. Based on that E-stack, we also have something called the E-wall, same capacity, but essentially just mounted against the wall. We've also taken the control electronics and just broken that out into what we call a control box, so that you get a much more easier way of expanding your system by keeping the control box with your first battery and then adding just more capacity on at a later stage if you choose to. So what's quite nice about the technology also, any of these products, you can add your capacity later, which will allow you to start small and essentially grow the system as the budget allows, or then as what the customer needs are also. That also then moved on to the X range, where people wanted something a little bit more commercial or light industrial, where each block is still interlocking with another one, but they are 21 kilowatt hours per block. That also allows you to grow the stack 5 units high up until 100 kilowatt hours with a 1000 amp output on the control box, which gives you a nice solution for your 3-phase light industrial applications. But the unit, we also wanted to just basically keep it quite manageable. You know, people can still carry the box through a door. You don't necessarily need anything besides manpower to assemble the unit. All of the products that I covered just now offer a 1C output and is based on the trusted lithium iron phosphate technology. As iGen, we bring in only first-tier manufacturer cells, so we only bring in EVE and CATL cells. All of that is covered with 4,000 cycles and 80% depth of discharge. And then obviously, we only do 16 cell configurations, which gives you a good voltage range on the low voltage applications. All of these products also have a built-in pre-charge, and that pre-charge can pre-charge a 15 kVA Quattro or 15 kVA sized system. They're CAN bus compatible with Victron, SMA, and SunSync, and that is our main form of communication for those products. Besides those products, we also have something called the Z range. So the Z range is more of an entry-level system design and offering. We have a nice discharge in a 20 amp charge rate, very similar to other products in the market, and also then compatible with a lot of the inverters that is available on the market. We also offer a freestanding rack system where the units also interlock, giving a nice air gap between them for heat dispensation, and you can parallel up until 64 units together. Just low voltage, so all of these are for your normal 48 volt or 52 volt nominal systems. That is the Z range. We are also working on a high voltage commercial offering called the Giga Rack that is close to launch. Each of these pylons or rack systems is essentially 143 kilowatt hours. And the high voltage is essentially adhering to your ATES and ARIO compatibility with 512 to 820 volt range. We've also basically upping the cycles on that due to a different spec of cell that is more suited for this range. And this is really for your containerized solutions and high voltage solutions for your commercial applications. Right, so just before we go into the Victron integration, I quickly just want to cover basically how you interlink the products. So taking the E-stack as a reference, you can see that it's got a block methodology. And then also it goes around to basically pointing out how the units stand on the floor. Each unit has got an adjustable foot at the bottom for the bottommost unit. So you can level the unit quite nicely. And then from there also you can then stack the other units on top. So let's just look at some diagrams and references. At the bottom of other units, you'll see that there's a stud, and that stud locates on the top of the bottom unit. So as soon as that stud is essentially locked in, the unit itself centers itself, and then you can basically connect all the other units from there. On the front of the unit, you'll see that there's a few things. There's DC bus bar interconnecting each other. There's communication cables for each unit, and then we obviously have cooling on demand that is controlled via the BMS. There's a start button with a yellow light when you initially start up, and then also a fan test button to just basically test your communication from one unit to another unit. Also at the back, that is basically the business side of the battery. At the back, we basically have outputs. So at the back of the unit, you'll have, if you have 1 to 2 units, you'll have DC posts for your negative, DC posts for your positive, and your communication out. Should you have 2 or more units, you'll see a secondary, basically the negative being broken out into being at the bottom of the unit. That just allows us to basically have a better spread of the load on the unit itself. Each post is 12 lug that you will need for that, and is rated for 250 amp output. So depending on your system size, you will use a single 50 square millimeter cable on a post, or then if you go above 10 kVA, you'll essentially run more than one out. And that is just another diagram of how they interlink. Right, I'm not going to go into the start procedure. Let me just open and see if there's any other questions at the moment, if you don't mind. Hi there, is there any question? All right, so let's carry on and take a deep dive into how we set this up with various systems. Right, so let's take Victron as a reference for how to integrate. So once you have the DC cables connected, you are essentially connected to the system, and you basically have to keep your communication cables disconnected until you have set up a Victron system. The reason for that is if you are maybe running at a different baud rate on your GX device, it might conflict with the battery, and the battery will go into protection protection mode, basically safeguarding itself. So we leave the communication disconnected so you can set up just on a straight DC. Also with that, we just note a few things. Keep your charging and discharging sources off. So your mppt and your PV string is essentially disconnected. With that also, your AC and your AC supply to your inverter side also needs to be disconnected. This is just so the system is not essentially discharging it severely or then charging the system without there being proper control in place. So with Victron, you basically need a few software components to this also, and some hardware components. So I just wanted to highlight that you can essentially get all of the software requirements from Victron themselves. And then for inverter setup, it is preferred to use the Mark III to USB adapter. Also note that we have our communication as a pin-to-pin with Victron. So you don't need a type B or type A cable. It's literally just a normal LAN cable or UTP cable that you can buy from the computer shop or make it up yourself, and that will work as a default with Victron itself. Commissioning also we do in sequence. So we do the GX device first, and that will go into deeper data just now. Then we do the mppt, and then we do the inverter. So let me quickly just reference how that all works. Once you install the software from Victron, let's just maybe go and have a look what that is. So if you go into any browser and you say Victron downloads, you will go to that URL that I gave you. What is nice from Victron is literally everything that you need is there. So Victron Connect is one of the apps that you will have to download that is used for the MPPTs and interfacing with other units via Bluetooth. That's quite an important one. And then if you go a little bit down, VE configuration tools for VE bus products, and you'll see that is also the picture for the inverter. So download this VE configuration tools. It's a few utilities that is grouped into one, and note that it's unfortunately only for Windows. So once you download that, you'll essentially get these 4 apps or programs downloaded for you. VE config is the main one, as well as VE flash. VE config is something that we'll touch on a little bit later. VE flash is also how you update the firmware on the inverter. What is nice about Victron also, if you go a little bit down, you'll see here that there's instructional videos on how to actually use VE configure, how to do VE flash, and then also remote VE configure via VRM, which is another possibility. But if you have an inverter that is straight stock factory, it's advised to do the VE configure process and VE flash with the Mark III first, and then you can always amend the settings via VRM if needed remotely. So by all means, go through these trading videos and just update yourself how to essentially use these utilities. And then, as I mentioned, VE Connect is also one that is quite important. So we'll go into deeper detail on each one of these. Firstly, we're going to use Victron Connect, and you can essentially connect that to a GX device. So if you open Victron Connect, we'll go and actually look via Bluetooth and on your network and whatever is available, and you'll go and see what your GX device is. This essentially will allow you to connect to the GX device, and when you have a battery that is lithium, you essentially need to do two things to get it onto the system, and that is what we're going to cover now. All right, so as you are connected to the GX device, you are sitting with a new device that don't have too much set up already. You might see that your inverter already is maybe listed as one of the items if the inverter is switched on. Otherwise, you'll just have notifications and settings. So the GX from Victron has got many different flavors. You get a color control GX, a Venus GX, Octo, and then obviously now the new Cerberus. So all of these devices allow you to communicate to your peripherals on Victron, but it also allows you to speak to the battery, and the battery also speaks into the Victron system via this. So you will connect your battery to the VE CAN port, and you will basically connect to the Victron Connect system and then set two settings. Those two settings are the baud rate and DVCC. So you'll go to settings, services, CAN bus port, and baud rate, and select 500 kilobits per second for all iGen products. Once that is done, we will go and do DVCC. But once that is done also, you will see that your product is now part of that list at the top. So go back to the main menu, and then you see your battery displaying there. If it does not display there, it essentially means that there's something wrong in the cabling. You need to double check your cable or the wiring until the battery is a registered device on the device list. Once that is done, you can go forward and essentially move on with your DVCC settings. So this was the hardware control. Now we're going to do the software control called DVCC. Right. So when you start up the system also on your battery, please verify your polarity. As you switch on the system, it will do a self-diagnostic, and then it will switch a pre-charge circuit on, enabling the system to be powered up. It normally takes about 20 to 30 seconds, and then you can basically have your system boot up. For DVCC, you're also just going to settings and then DVCC, and you have to switch it on always. There's no negotiating that, please. So you can refer to the manual for the actual list of what you need to do in the DVCC protocol. Some products are different, so just reference the notes in the manual itself if it's not auto-populated already. So just to go over that again, you'll go to settings, DVCC, and then switch DVCC on. To connect to the inverter, you basically have to have this Mark III to USB adapter, and then you need the VE config app that I just showed you now. When you do an MPPT configuration, you might need the VE direct to USB cable, but these days, most people just use the VE Connect app because most of the MPPTs are Bluetooth enabled. So just make sure before you go to site or when you order your products that you know what you need to set them up also. Right, so let's go into the inverter setup. As I mentioned, you use VE config. Victron Connect we'll touch on later when we do the MPPT, and I'll show you how that works. So when you connect with Victron VE configure, it will essentially open the app for you, and it will download the settings that you might need. On the first tab, you will basically see a general tab, just showing what your AC input is, and then also your battery monitor as a fallback. just reference your manual as to what your system size in amp hours is, and make sure you put that in. Note that your charging efficiency is always 98%. I always overrule by remote switch this on so that from the GX device, I can always amend my AC input depending on what the size of the breaker is on the DB board. So you can always derate it from there. But you can't do that if this is not selected. So please just make sure that you have that as a default. When you look at grid settings, there's two that we basically use. You use either other, or then if you have a multi+2 device, you will then use the NRS subset. That is also default there. All of the settings essentially after that is used as defaults, just to safeguard any of the AC inputs. These days with load shedding, sometimes when the grid comes back, it's not a proper AC supply. And these settings just safeguard the inverter and the rest of the settings and the rest of the peripherals should the AC supply actually be too low or too high. Next, we're going to look at the inverter. This is essentially the discharging tab of the inverter, meaning that should CAN bus fail, what is the defaults for voltage that the system are allowed to go down to? So your input low shutdown is essentially 48, input low restart is 52, and your input low pre-alarm 51.5. Victron also on the new firmware have got a shutdown based on SOC, and we basically adhere to 10% shutdown, 20% restart. The reason the low restart is high and your low restart SOC is high also, you don't want your system to re-engage the loads of the home when the battery is very depleted. You must essentially allow it to charge up a little bit, and then you can then allow the circuits to be reconnected, which the system will do essentially automatic based on these settings. The next tab that we're going to look at is the charger tab. This is just also a fallback should the CAN bus fail, because the CAN bus essentially tells the system at what rate it needs to be charged and discharged. So these are all fallbacks. Make sure that lithium battery is selected. And then on the iGen products, we basically have one set point for absorption and flow, and that is 54. We don't use any virtual switching, because if you have a virtual switch, you can't use ESS as an assistant. So let's just talk about assistants. ESS is basically an assistant that Victron brought out that incorporates hub 1 and hub 4. This allows you to manage your energy and where it's coming from, but it's only used with systems that are connected to the grid. So that will be in the hybrid system where you are connected to the grid and essentially have a PV system also. And then this algorithm and ESS will help you to manage your energy via the GX device. And we can have a look at that a little bit later also. So once you go into the assistant setup, you can basically go and just add the assistant. You start the assistant. These are a few precautionaries to go through. Just go through them and understand what it says. Make sure that you are selecting LivePO4 or LFP with other BMS, as we touched on previously. We don't use any other setting. Make sure your capacity and amp hours is the same as what you had in the front. So this is now for a 2-block system was 210, or then for a 1-block system will be 105 amp hours. We don't want to change the battery type that we saw just now under the charger. Our sustained voltage is set at default for a 52 volt or 48 volt system. Dynamic cutoffs, everything is on 48. Restart offset is also default, 1.2 volts. And you can go and get details on this on Victron's website also as to what these settings are. PV inverters are for AC coupled systems. So this system does not have one. Go and read up on Victron in case you want to find out a little bit more about that. This does not apply to a DC coupled MPPT. So if you have a normal Victron MPPT connected, you don't need to have any settings here. You can see this is an AC out of the multi or quattro system. So we normally select that as no. It gives you a nice summary of what settings you need or what have been changed. And it's done. So once this is done, you can essentially upload it either via this remote file or then via send all settings. And that will then update your inverter with all of the settings that you need to have the system running safely. After this, we're going to do the Victron config tool, and we're going to look at how you set up an mppt. So what's nice about the Victron Connect tool, you can actually go and demo a specific device. So let's go and do an mppt quickly. Let's have a look here. Solar chargers. Let's go do a 250 mppt. We can. Right. So with all settings, it will give you a history here on the front, but you go to the gear on the top to go and see what the settings are, and you go to battery. Obviously, we are running a 48-volt system. If it's not selected, please select it as 48 volts. You want to have user-defined settings, and your max charge current in most settings, you can basically leave it at maximum of what the MPPT is capable of. Our batteries are quite capable of accepting high charge currents. So you can most likely 80% of the time basically keep this as maximum of what the MPPT can do. As I mentioned, all of our charge set points as a fallback is 54 volts. Make sure that you do absorption, float, and equalization. The BMS will essentially give higher targets than this, and this is just a fallback should that fail. So once these three settings are in, you're essentially done. You don't have to do any other settings besides 48 volts, max charge current, and then defaulting all of these settings to that. Once you've changed these settings, it's already uploaded to the MPPT, and you are done. Another thing that is quite nice about VE config or VE Connect, apologies, is that once you connect to it, it will automatically update the firmware to it. So you don't have to worry. As soon as you see this screen, you're essentially up to date and you can access the device. Just a note on the other apps that are downloaded together with VE config. VE Flash is something that basically updates the inverter's flash memory. So when you open that and you click start, and this is now if you are connected to an inverter with a Mark III, all right? Just take note that it will erase all of the settings that is on the inverter. So if you have settings loaded already, just make sure you can go and exit this. Make sure that you go and connect to this via VE config. And that you can go and save the settings. So just make sure that you save your settings before you do any firmware update. Another thing that's quite nice about VE config is that you can go and see what kind of firmware version is actually on the system itself. So let me quickly go there to this one, just waiting for it to load. All right, and then you can see the actual chipset and the version that you need. So when you do a firmware update, you will need all of this data to go and find out what the correct firmware file is. There's two ways where you can go and get the file, and that is on Victron Professional Portal. You have to register there. And then you can also then go and link your Dropbox. And that will then give you a folder like this, where all of the Victron firmware, etc., is loaded and it's updated, which is quite nice if you do a few things or a few installs and you go quite far. As soon as Dropbox connects to the net, it will download all of the firmwares that you might need. Go and look at in the firmware folder. There's only two that we use in South Africa because we run 230 volts. That is 19 and 26. 19 you almost will never use because that's for very old firmware subsets. And then 26 is essentially where we want. So if you look at here, 26 is already what we are referencing. And then 55 is the actual chipset of the inverter, what type of inverter it is. And you can see that it's a 400 version firmware. So that last 3 digits tells you the version of the firmware. and that is the 400 version firmwares. And then you can see a few iterations back, and you can then also go and see what firmware you need. So for this one specifically, 2655.486 is the newest. This inverter specifically has got 476 on it. And you can decide if you want to upgrade or not. That essentially covers the Victron setup for the inverter as well as the mppt. Just want to ask if there's any specific questions that we can handle around that. All right. So with Victron as a reference, also note that you can essentially use other inverters also. So let's go and have a look at SunSynk. Right. So on SunSynk, you basically have a few things that are different. You need to make sure that you tell us that you are going to use the system for SunSync, because we send the battery with a cable that is made for it. So the pin outs are slightly different. You can see here that your pin outs can low, where it was in Victron pin 8 or the brown wire, that will then go to pin 5. Pin 7 can high is then pin 4. So you can make this cable up also yourself if you want. And then besides that also, you need to make sure that the firmware on the SunSync is updated. In the old days, there was SolarMan. They brought out a new web logger. So kindly use that rather than the SolarMan app. Update to the latest firmware and make sure that the cable essentially is correct. If the cable is correct, that will then give you data going through to the SunSync inverter. If you go to the top of the screen, it's all touch, or then via the navigation points. On that gear, if you click there and you go to Live BMS on the bottom right corner, that will allow you to see the screen that is here on the top in the middle. This is basically everything that is sent from the BMS. And if you don't see this screen, once again, you need to check your wiring of the communication cable and make sure that it is correct. Once this is registered on here, you essentially have that link between the battery and the inverter. After this, you can go and connect your web logger. That's an example of how it looks. It just connects at the bottom. Set it up, get your site set up, and then come back to the inverter and do a few settings. So let's go through those settings. Once again, if you press that gear, there's the second one on the left is called battery. So once you select that, it will give you these settings where you can go to battery type, battery charge, and shutdown. On battery type, you select lithium. You input once again your amp hours of the size of the system that you have, your charge rate. Your inverter might just be a little bit small to actually do the full capacity of what the battery can do. Our batteries will start at 100 amps charge rate and discharge at 100, and then obviously select the CAN communication. Your battery charge tab, which is the one that you see here, once again, put in your amps for charging, float and absorption, everything is defaulted to 54. And then your shutdown is the next screen that will go to 5% for shutdown, low battery 20%, and restart once again at 20%. So once again, very easy to set up, not too many things to change. The critical thing remains that you need to get your communication between the inverter and the battery confirmed. If there's any questions or help that you might need, here's all our contact details and where we are. We're in 4 ways. Should you need help in setting up a system, you can always make contact with us. And then obviously we can arrange a remote setup and to help you through that. But when you order the battery also, just tell us basically what you're going to pair it with, so we can make sure that our support is in line with that and the batteries essentially also are set up for that. If there's any other questions, please feel free to put it into the chat itself, and then we can have a chat around any questions that you might have for any of the setups. It's quite straightforward. As I mentioned, just make sure that your communication is sorted, and then the rest is pretty straightforward from there. We also have a support email, so similar to what you have for sales, there is support at iGen, and I will basically put that in the chat. If you have any other questions, even when you are on site, or if you want to link your system and have us to have a look at it on VRM, you can use the support email as a reference, and then the support team will come back to you. This was very short and sweet. There's not too many questions, so feel free also, if there's anything that you might think about later, even going through the training session, let us know and we'll come back to you by email. And we thank you for your time. I'll leave it open for about 2 minutes just for extra questions, if there might be, or any other topics that you want to go over again. Feel free, we still have time. Just in closing, I would also highlight a product that we currently have in stock called the Nano. This is a portable unit, 700 watts output, 750 watt hours capacity. It's got a lot of USB functions for charging your phones, etc. You can charge it via a solar panel also. It's got an AC charger built in that comes with the unit. So this is a very nice unit also for just your load shedding, driving your router or your laptop and a few lights. Very portable, so you can take it also if, on a festive season. I don't think load shedding is something that's going to be something that's going to end soon. So it's quite a nice unit for portable usage, but also just for something smaller than a full-fledged solar system install. Just get in contact with the sales team as the details are there. These units are currently in stock, but they are selling fast. So if it makes a good Christmas present also, should anyone be interested. So once again, from my side, thank you so much for your time. I know it was short and sweet. There seems to be a question. Feel free to unmute yourself and we can answer any questions that you might have.
Hi, Jacques. Sorry, just a quick one on Victron or SunSynk with iGen. You often find, or this is just one challenge I've encountered recently, whereby the firmware of the battery, I think, was set for a Victron, and I was using a SunSynk, and as a result, the unit couldn't communicate with the system.
Correct.
In terms of the firmware update on the battery itself, is it something that us as installers can do ourselves, or do we always have to reach out to you guys for firmware updates on the battery itself?
So we do offer a training program on our side. Once you have gone through the training program, we allow you to actually do firmware upgrades, as well as adding capacity, different batteries to each other. So it's a bit of a training process. Out of the gate, we will assist you remotely, but any firmware also going forward in the new year, your firmware will be backwards compatible between Victron and SunSynk, so we should not have that problem going forward. It's also very important to basically just make sure you tell us beforehand what you're ordering, and then the production team will make sure that we load the correct firmware.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Also, one thing to note, as I mentioned with SunSynk, we actually make a cable for you that's 3 meters in length. With that also, if you don't see that cable when you take delivery of your battery, you're welcome to check before you take delivery of the battery. That also then means that it maybe was not set up for SunSynk. So it's a lot of things to just confirm, but it all comes down to communication, and that starts with the initial sale. You just let us know, and then we can go from there. No worries. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for your time. Like I mentioned, this recording will be made available, and then you can go through it on your spare time. If there's any questions, by all means, make contact with us, but also go and have a look at the manufacturers of the inverters websites, even our own website. There's a lot of content on there where people can give training and have some ways of doing things before. So it's a nice learning opportunity over December also to brush up on skills and stay current. That last point is something also very important. Make sure that you stay current. This industry is fast growing, fast paced. Our training will also be amended from time to time, but also on the Victron and SunSynk, there's a lot of new things they are bringing out. Attend their training seminars, attend our training seminars, and then just always stay up to date. You will differentiate yourself essentially in the market with that. With that, I just want to sign off on my side. I wish everyone a blessed festive season. Stay safe and travel safe, and all the best from us and our team. Thank you so much.